kumeyaay, native perspectives back into the wetland, because of course, Mission Bay would have been a very important place to the kumeyaay, and many of them and their youth are no longer able to access that area. So it's kicking off a multi-year project to try to make sure that we really are bringing in Indigenous perspectives, and we're really excited about it. Aside from that, we have the Wonder Wetlands Project programs, like Heather mentioned, second and fourth Saturday of every month. And we also have some really exciting research looking at how much carbon is being sequestered in the wetlands there. So we can pitch it to the city as a good reason to make sure we expand those wetlands and sequester as much carbon as we can. San Diego Audubon also has a few other things coming up. This Saturday, we've got a book and gear sale at our office from 10 o'clock to 2 p.m. We're located at 4010 Marina Boulevard. It's going to be in our parking lot, and it's like used birding gear, books, binoculars. So if you are interested in getting involved in birding, it's a really cool opportunity. Heather, do you want to do an intro for?
Sure, I'll introduce you. Yeah.
So I'll pass that on.
All right, thanks, Megan. Lots of stuff happening. Yeah, so it's my great pleasure to introduce Kim Sawyer. She is actually a Southern California native and a UC San Diego alum. Alumni. After graduating from UCSD, she worked for several years for different governmental agencies and environmental consulting companies. And then she started her graduate program at the University of Idaho in the Department of Wildlife Science?
Wildlife and Fisheries Science.
Wildlife and Fisheries Science. She has, bless her heart, she's been living at the Pebble Cross Marsh trailer for the last 2 or 3 months and doing her research on the endangered, federally listed endangered Ridgeways Rail throughout coastal San Diego. And I am super excited to hear about your work, Kim, and take it away.
Awesome. I'm going to stand over here, so I'm going to turn this. Okay, yeah, thank you, Heather and San Diego Audubon for having me. Thank you, everyone, for being here in person and online. Oh, we have a dual slide switching. There we go. So today we're going to talk about the Ridgeways Rail. So there are 3 different subspecies of Ridgeways Rail. There's the California, which is found in Northern California and San Francisco Bay Area. And I worked with that species for 6 or 7 years. There's the Yuma Ridgeways Rail, found in freshwater marshes throughout the Colorado River Basin and in southeastern California at the Salton Sea. And there's the light-footed, which is found here in San Diego and in coastal wetlands from Ventura down and through Baja, Mexico. And so the light-footed subspecies has been listed as endangered since the 1970s. And it was actually listed before what we know as the Endangered Species Act was fully enacted. So it's really one of the original endangered species. So we've known that this bird is both rare and threatened for 50 years now. And so why is this bird threatened? As is true with many endangered species, habitat loss is a huge contributing factor. So California has lost about 90% of its historic wetlands. And these birds, they thrive in wetlands, so they really need them to survive. And fortunately, since the 1970s, there's been a few different acts like the Clean Water Act and the California Coastal Act that has preserved the wetlands that are left. Those wetlands, they're very fragmented. So they're not only individual wetlands are fragmented from each other, so they may be a few miles apart to hundreds of miles. In the case of a wetland in Ventura County, and the closest one might be all the way in Orange County. But individual wetlands themselves are also fragmented by things like the I-5 freeway and train tracks, and many of them are surrounded by large apartment complexes and places that are difficult for this species in particular to navigate. Additionally, these habitats are threatened by things like sea level rise. So as sea level begins to rise and tides become higher, these marshes don't really have anywhere to go because they're surrounded by these urban landscapes, so they can't move further inward. So really they're fit into this, phrase, they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. And so one reason why this bird in particular has trouble surviving these fragmented habitats is they don't really fly around a lot. If you've ever seen a Ridgways rail try to fly, they're not the best flyers. You might think it's a bird, they can fly around and navigate these landscapes. No, it's
Missing a few slides.
oh.
Carry on.
Yeah, it should be a picture. Huh. Okay, well.
Is that the right slide, Kim? It's just
No, it's just a picture of a rail.
Well, keep going. We can imagine a rail.
Okay. Yeah, it's a nice picture. Okay, well, yeah, so these birds, they're not great flyers. They spend most of their time moving around on their legs. They have some of the strongest leg to body strength ratio of any birds, and lots of rail species throughout the world have actually evolved to be flightless. And that's because they're specialists. I'm just gonna click through for my own sake on this computer. They're specialists to the marsh. So they've really adapted to this particular environment because it's got everything that they need. It's got this low, dense cover that they can hide in from predators, and it's got lots of food. It's got crabs, it's got insects and invertebrates. So they've got lots of food to depend on. So they don't really need to fly often. In fact, rails and many other water birds, each year they do something called a simultaneous molt. So all birds, they will lose their primary flight feathers at some point during the year, but most birds, they lose one or two at a time, and they can fly at any point. But rails and other water birds like ducks and geese, they'll just do it all at once. They'll lose all of their feathers and they'll grow them all in at once. And so they have a period of time where they can't fly at all. So especially this time of year, if you happen to see a rail running around, it might be because it actually can't fly. And they look pretty funny, like little cartoon characters, really. So yeah, these birds are really kind of the definition of a homebody. They don't leave if they don't have to. They've got everything that they need. Oh, well, this is a video, but that's
The next one that shows up.
that's all right.
How many slides are there? A lot of slides before this one.
Let's see. It's only a couple slides behind.
You can see it on the Zoom.
All right, well, let me see.
Let's I think we should stop and try and fix this. Could you download, maybe you,
So yeah, it's showing all. Sure.
Yeah, it's strange.
maybe if you download from the Google Drive or from the hard drive to your laptop. There's a lot of stuff.
Yeah, actually, it's pretty much all over now. Right now.
Or maybe
Newer. Sorry, guys. Okay. So. Okay. Sure, now.
Great. what we're reading. Are you able to go?
It should be showing already.
How many of you have seen our Ridgeways Rail? And where did you see them? Silverhill? Shout out. Lots of places. Yeah.
Tijuana River.
Tijuana Estuary, that's where I see the Tijuana Estuary. Oh. Oh, really?
Yeah.
All right, here we go. Okay, great.
There's the picture.
That was worth it.
That's thanks to a field technician. That picture. Okay.
There we go.
Yeah. You can switch to the next slide. And this one is a video, if it plays. It's short. Yeah, so this is a time lapse actually taken at Kendall Frost of a tide coming in. So these birds are really adapted to the marshes and they don't like to leave it, but they're really adapted to this pretty amazing environment that's constantly changing. Every 6 hours, you know, it's mud flats or it's this flooded grassy area. And so it's really pretty amazing the things that they've adapted to. And it's sort of understandable that they don't want to leave. They know how to survive there, and it's got everything that they need. And so going back to this idea that they are sort of between a rock and a hard place, but I don't want to be all doom and gloom about it. So these birds, there's a lot of time and energy going into managing them and understanding their survival and making sure that their populations are continuing. And so there is actually a captive breeding program that involves a few different organizations, the Living Coast Discovery Center, SeaWorld, and San Diego Safari Park. And this has been going on since 2001. So since then, they've released, this is a little out of date, it's almost 600 captively bred birds have been released into 14 different marshes throughout the range, the US range of this species. So every year, there's breeding pairs at all these 3 facilities that I mentioned, and they have chicks, and they raise those chicks until they're about 8 weeks old. And once they get to be 8 weeks, that's about when in the wild they're starting to kind of fend for their own, and they're able to fly. So they start moving away from their parents. So they put them into these proving pens, which is this photo on the upper right hand corner. So it sort of simulates this marsh environment. You can't really see it, but it's got a little creek running through it. They can kind of forage on their own and move around a little bit more. And they also have these little thatch things on the side. They can run around and hide in the vegetation like they would in the wild. And so every year they release birds into different marshes. And since the early 2000s, when this program was started, the way they've sort of been monitoring how well this program has been working is they do breeding surveys every year, and they look at the population numbers and see if they're increasing or staying the same. And for the most part, they've seen an increase in the population with a few small drops, which is pretty normal for this kind of a species. But they don't know a ton other than the general size of the population. So what we're trying to understand is just what happens when these captive birds are released. You know, how are they using the marshes that they're released in? Are they using the same kinds of habitats as wild birds? How long are they surviving out there? Are they able to breed the next year? What's going on? And so we are putting out these little backpacks, satellite transmitters on these captive juveniles that will be released into different marshes. And these transmitters, they take 2 GPS points every day, and they upload them to satellites, which then send them to my computer, and then I can just go online and see where the birds are, which is pretty cool. And so to really understand what the captive birds are doing, we also want to understand what the wild birds are doing. So what that means is that we spent a lot of time in the marsh, getting really dirty, got a dedicated crew of field technicians who follow me around the marsh while I leap across channels and try not to get stuck in the mud, and clean over channels. And you might be wondering how exactly we would catch a rail. So what we do is we mostly spend a lot of time in the marsh. We look for signs of birds. So like I was saying, they don't fly a lot, so they're running around all the time. So we are looking for their tracks. It's a good sign that a bird is nearby. And most of these marshes, they have a lot of different channels. So these birds are spending a lot of time walking around the channels, foraging, hiding from predators. So we use these channels, which are sort of the natural pathway of these birds. And we put out something called a noose carpet, which is just a square piece of mesh metal that has little nooses or lassos tied to it. And when the birds walk over it, they get stuck, and we're right there, and we're able to ban them and put these satellite transmitters on them. So last year was the first year that we started this project, and we put out a total of 31 transmitters, and that is, we put half of those on wild birds that we caught and half of those on captive birds that were then released. We did that at 2 sites, so Badquitos Lagoon in Carlsbad and Tijuana Slough National Wildlife Refuge. And there's a wild bird that we caught. And so this year we are still deploying transmitters. Well, for one more day. I'm going back to Idaho on Friday. And we're going to the same study sites. This year, I think we put out almost 20 transmitters. Then we've added one more site at South San Diego Bay. And so when we are out there looking for rails, one thing that we have to do is we have to figure out if they're juveniles or adults, because the captive birds that we're releasing are all juvenile rails that were born that year. And we want to compare them with the wild birds. We want to make sure those are also juveniles. So this photo on the bottom right is just, these are actually human Ridgeways rails, but they have very similar characteristics. And so the best way to know if it's a juvenile is you can see this wing is kind of picked up, and they lack this sort of like streaking that is there. Black and white barring. But otherwise, they can look very similar. Sometimes you don't really know until you have them in your hand. Here we go. And so just to look back on what we've seen in the last year, what we've already learned from just one field season. And I'll preface this by saying we are putting these transmitters out on juvenile birds, which in general have a low survival rate, and rails as well are not species that lives for very long. Their annual survival rate is pretty low because they're a prey species. You know, we call them a marsh chicken. So this is a pretty normal survival rate, but what you can see, which is super important information for understanding the captive breeding program, is the captive birds, which are this blue line, the first 2 or 3 weeks after they're released into the wild, their survival rate is much lower than the wild birds. So what we can do with that information is figure out why that is, and are they being eaten by raptors or what's going on, and how can we try to get them past that 2 or 3 week period to make sure that they survive longer in the wilds. And so this is a map of 3 of the birds from last year. that we put satellite transmitters on. And so this is at Tijuana Slough National Wildlife Refuge, and this bottom bird, the light blue one, that's the little diamond, is one of the captive birds that was released. And the other two triangle shapes are wild birds that we captured. And this is a whole year worth of their locations. So like I said before, they're really homebodies. It's maybe not the easiest to tell on this map, but they're not moving more than 400 or 500 meters from where we captured them. And so once they find a place that they like, they kind of stay there. And the captive birds, so this blue one at the bottom, the square with the X in the middle of it is the location where we released that bird. And so they move around a little bit more because they're being moved into this new environment. They have to find their place. So this one actually moved down south to this channel, and we think it bred this year. It had some GPS locations that indicated it was like probably had a nest, and we went out and checked it out, and we found a little nest bowl. So we think it might have had a successful breeding season. And this was some exciting information that happened this year. This is a bird that we released again at Tijuana Slough National Wildlife Refuge at the end of June, and it's the first bird that we've had actually moved to a different marsh. So it spent one night where we released it, and then flew north about 2.5 miles to the South San Diego Bay salt ponds that are now restored to marshes. So that was pretty exciting to see. And so continuing on with this study, we're working with USGS, who is doing a genetic study to further understand the genetic structure of the species, and if the captive birds that are being released, if their genetics have moved through the population to help understand more about the captive breeding program. And we're working with some partners in Mexico to understand more about the population down there to get like a better full picture of this subspecies. And yeah, thank you everyone. I put my email up there if anybody has any questions. Thank you Audubon for having me, and Kendall Frost for letting me live there. It's very hard to find housing on a research budget, so it's a great place to be.
All right, thank you, Kim. I'm sure Kim will entertain questions.
Yes, of course.
I'm interested in what has been shown concerning the adaptability of Ridgway rails to cope with climate change. As if the ocean rises a foot, you're going to be losing this all our marshes. Do you know of any improvement, introduction of the rails in freshwater marshes in the state of Southern California?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are some populations in some freshwater marshes. They're on the San Diego River in Del Mar area. It's right between a golf course and soccer fields. There's a population that's been doing pretty well there in freshwater marsh.
Just happens to the area, that area is not like upstream of the whole freshwater marshes.
Yeah. Up inland from El Camino Real, it's part of the river. It's all freshwater up there, all cattails. And there's not a ton known about populations further inland. There are some reports of yearly rails at places. Kumeyaay Lake, yeah.
But not
yeah, so that is another thing that we need to learn more about, is how they're able to move up further into the system.
Can you talk a little bit about those little things we see from a distance, like little teepees, or are they using those, or are they
Yeah, the little rafts out there.
Is it actually floating, so it's high tide and we're floating up?
Yeah, so those move up and down with the tide, and they do use them. At Kendall Frost, there are a few that have cameras that have some pretty cool videos of birds building nests on them. I think bring their chicks on them during high tides, and so they're definitely a good thing that the birds do use. And I know that there's some they're putting more out at a lot of different sites as well to provide some cover as the tides increase.
How many, I've been here when there's lots of, how many eggs do you find in a nest?
Oh, they typically have 7 to 9 eggs in a nest. Yeah. So they have a lot of babies. Yes.
For the bird that you saw move from the Tijuana Slough to South Bay, did it stay there? Did it stay in South Bay, or
Yeah,
is it still around? Or?
it's still there, still in a similar area to where it seemed to fly straight to this one. It's Pond 11, they call it. It seems to be using the same area since the end of June, so it's been almost 2 months now. Yeah, so it flew there. It was at Tijuana Slough in the evening, and the next morning it was at South San Diego Bay. So. Yeah.
Who are the predators?
They have quite a lot of predators, mostly northern harriers, raccoons. Well, eat both nests and sometimes adults, but mostly we find that they are being predated by raptors, by hawks and harriers, and peregrine falcons, things like that. Yes.
Do you have any sense of how much contiguous habitat they need to be able to thrive? And obviously bigger better, but is there any sense of like, hey, we haven't been able to get them established in something smaller?
That's a good question. So they do maintain pretty small breeding territories. So that one map that I showed you, they don't move around a lot. So their home range is about 400 square meters. So one breeding pair might not need a ton of space, but once they have chicks and those chicks want to move and create their own territory, not sure to have a population that is supporting itself, how much space they need. That's a good question.
I'm sure you covered it, but their main diet is like things that are found in the marsh in the tidal zone.
Yeah, so they're pretty opportunistic. They'll eat anything they can find, but they mostly seem to eat insects. We see them foraging a lot, spiders along the channels. They'll eat a lot of crabs, snails, and there is this one very cool picture that I've seen of one actually hunting and catching a cliff swallow that was foraging for mud. Not sure how often they do that, but it's pretty cool. Yes.
So it looked like the survival rate for the captive bred birds ultimately was like 10%, and for the wild was around 30. Is that correct?
That sounds about right. Yeah.
Has that data been informative for the breeding program at all? And are they looking at that, how to improve survival rates for the released birds?
Yeah, definitely. So we work pretty closely with the captive breeding program and with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and so been talking about a lot of potential solutions. So that sort of proving pen that I showed a picture of that they go into it for a couple of weeks. We think it actually might be a bit stressful for those birds, and they tend to lose a lot of weight. And so one solution is we're trying to potentially release them a bit earlier and have them spend less time in there. Some birds that have been released earlier are still surviving, so we know that they can. And we also, are looking at potentially doing some sort of like predator aversion training that's done in a lot of captive breeding programs. So kind of teaching them that a raptor sound of a hawk is not good and they should run and hide. So those have been used in other captive breeding programs pretty successfully. So there's a lot of brainstorming going on. Yes.
I was wondering, is it known that you don't have enough birds that are trapped? Is it known how the juveniles disperse compared to their parents? Are they staying near their parents?
So once, I don't really know the answer to that question. Once we were catching them and putting these transmitters on them and looking at their locations, they're already able to fly and they're already probably away from where they were, where they're born, where their parents' territory is. And we actually did catch a bird this year that we caught as a younger chick, and then we caught it about 5 or 6 weeks later, and it was, I mean, these marshes aren't super big, but it was a ways away from its parents. So they certainly are dispersing within the marsh that they're in a bit, but we don't usually catch them till they're a bit older, so we're not sure what happens in the meantime. They do, yeah, they swim. Yeah, you'll see them swim across. Surprisingly, I've seen them. Oh, it's not on that side. You'll see them swim across pretty wide channels. They're pretty good swimmers. It is cool to see them.
I could tell that the babies float. The really young chicks, they have some footage where they were on a raft and it looked as though a chick had fallen off. And then the other chicks just went and jumped in. They jumped in after and they kind of bob around. And then the adults retrieve them by picking them up by their heads.
Yeah.
Kim, have you noticed that populations in different marshes have varied somewhat in their behaviors?
Yeah, I have. Yeah, that's a good question. There are definitely some marshes that it seems that birds are a bit more outgoing. They'll
Like
walk.
where would that be?
Tijuana Slough, so those are good places to see them if you want to see them. Yeah, they'll kind of, I'm not sure if it's exposure to humans or what it is, but they'll kind of just walk right past you and look at you and mind you no business. But at other marshes, we'll have a hard time finding any rails, and we'll know that they're there. We'll see their tracks, or we'll know based on the survey numbers that there are plenty of birds around, but they're just much harder, much shyer, I guess.
Where would some of those places?
The Kendall frost birds are particularly hard to find. So let's see. At Bataquitos Lagoon, they're a bit shyer. It also, yeah, I don't totally know why. I have lots of hypotheses in my head. It seems like maybe some places where there's like a lot of raccoons, the birds are a bit more or less interested in coming out into the open, which makes a lot of sense. But yeah. Yes.
How long do the transmitters last? Does it just fall off?
Yeah, so their battery life lasts 2 to 3 years. And then the way that they're put together, they have these little clasps wasps that will degrade and fall off, and they'll come off the bird probably in 3 to 4 years, something like that. Yeah, so they actually will make 2 different, so they make an incubation nest where they lay all of their eggs, and then they're both, they look pretty similar. They're both just a big bowl made of like pickleweed and other vegetation that they put together, and then they'll also have, it's called a brood nest, where they will have their very young chicks in that nest, and those nests actually have like a little ramp built into it, which is pretty cool, so the chicks can go in and out. Yes.
And is it 1 parent or 2 parents that's going out?
Yeah, so both parents will incubate. The males will incubate at night, and the females do most of the incubation during the day. But they'll both care for the chicks. They spend a few days sort of dependent on their parents, but they're mostly able to walk around and forage a bit on their own. Their parents will keep feeding them for a few weeks, but they're not like songbirds or nestlings that need their parents to feed them constantly, and they can't leave the nest. Within a few days, they're able to walk around on their own. Yes. So they start breeding and sort of setting up their territories in like February, and they'll start having nests in March or April, and they incubate those eggs for about a month. And some birds will have multiple nests throughout the year, but not sure how common that is, to be honest. But yeah, they take about a month until the chicks are born.
How large do they get and how long have you been doing this?
They get about, trying to imagine holding one. Maybe about that big. They've got really long legs. Their body is like maybe like that, and their legs are probably about the same size as their body. And this is my second field season, so I started last year in April or so, and I have worked with Ridgeways Rails before in the San Francisco Bay area. Yeah, I've been doing this about 2 years. Yeah, we will do a combo of the two. We use playback to help kind of lure them into where our traps are, because they're very territorial species. So we'll play a couple calls and get the birds to come in. Makes it a quicker for both of us. They look the same, but males are bigger. Yeah, so they're about 100 grams bigger. I don't know what that is in pounds, but yes. Yes, good question. So it's it's in our permits. We have all sorts of permits with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the state. I don't know that it's illegal for an average person, but it's usually yeah, it does affect their behavior. So we're doing it to like collect data and information now. Yes.
How many
question. So we have captured rails there to contribute to this genetic study that's going on with USGS, and I think we have caught 4 or 5 birds there. And then I live there, so I hear them all the time. But I think this year there were what, 10 pairs, Isabel?
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, I think we, from the whole town.
Yeah. Yes. I don't know if I can. They make a lot of different noises, actually. It's pretty interesting. So there's individual calls for males that they will use to find females, and there's calls that females will use to find males. So the males do what's called a cack, and they'll just like constantly really make this cacking noise. So cack, 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 like searching for females. Females do what's called a cack burr, similar. They add a burr to the end of it, and then once they pair up and they have a mate, they do what's called a clatter, and they'll do it together. So we call it a duet, which is, I can't make that voice, but it's pretty cool to hear. And it's very loud. Yeah, they're related subspecies on the East Coast is called the clapper rail, because it really sounds like a loud, like sort of clappering noise. Yeah, so they mostly call around dawn and dusk, early in the morning, and right at sunset. Yes.
The map you showed of the Tijuana estuary area, the like 3 main areas where we're finding a large number of them. And I was just wondering, is there a correlation between where you find them and particular types of saltwater marsh vegetation that they kind of require to have before they'll accept an area as a good area?
Yeah, they seem to, I haven't looked at anything very in depth. They seem to prefer tall stands of cordgrass, so it's a tall, skinny marsh vegetation, looks like a grass, and that's often the sort of vegetation that we would find a nest in. But they'll also like really dense areas of pickleweed, which is what's in this photo. And they seem, I mean, at Tijuana, they seem to like to be around the channels. So we'll find nests right on the edge of a channel where there's a big stand of tall cordgrass.
One way to help them be to have more of these kinds of vegetation in the ocean water.
Yeah, I think I'm not super familiar with marsh vegetation and restoration, but I know marshes take quite a long time to naturally grow this, and even restoration can take a very long time, but certainly more would be great.
I would like to say
Yeah.
something about that,
Please.
as somebody from Camouflage Marsh. So one of the reasons that they have artificial nest platforms at Camouflage Marsh is because our cordgrass is really, really windy. So our cordgrass, so Kim just said they like nice tall cordgrass, right? So our cordgrass, we have historical pictures, thank you, the Kendall and Home families. We have historical pictures of the marsh where the cordgrass was so thick you could not walk. It's over your head, not walk through it so thick. Now we have pictures in lots of places it's barely up to your knee, and there's, and it's very sparse. And we have a graduate student did some work a while ago suggesting that the reason it's so sparse is because it doesn't get enough nutrients. It doesn't get enough nutrients because it's separated from Rose Creek. Rose Creek is the main source of sediment into Mission Bay, and it's now separated in Rose Creek doesn't flow into Kendall Cross, which flows right into, so all of those nutrients just flow into the bay and cause pollution instead of flowing into the marsh, which could provide nutrients for cordgrass, which would allow the cordgrass to grow lush, which would really help the Ridgeways rails. So that's that, and that's probably the main reason that we have those artificial nest platforms. Cordgrass just isn't thick enough for the rails to make their own nests. So that is one way that we can really help them, is at least at Kendall Frost, by reconnecting Rose Creek to the marsh.
Yes. Is it possible for the birds to drown during high tide events, especially king tides, the highest tide of the year?
I think what is more common is probably they run out of vegetation to hide in and get depredated by a raptor or something else that knows that it's going to be easy pickings during the high tide. So I think that is probably more of the threat in that scenario, I guess.
Yeah, I should say that at Kendall Cross, there is trapping for what are called mesopredators, so not as large as coyotes, because coyotes are missing from the ecosystem. Like coyotes, we wouldn't have this mesopredators such as cats, raccoons, possums, which also like pigs, rats. So there is actually trapping, and sometimes we catch people's pet cats. So we really want people to keep their cats out of the wetland, out of the marsh at home. So sometimes we catch them. But yeah, that's an issue, especially to prevent sleep.
Why are there no calories?
Sorry?
Why are there no calories?
Because they're cut off by development. We had like 2 in 30 years that we managed to get through, but camp plans, kind of the way, all the fences.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, yes, it should be in Rose Canyon, right, and Rose Creek, but then
They can't get
it's not easy to get up in the marsh, yeah. Good question.
All right, any more questions? Well, let's thank Kim again. Thank you so much, Kim, and I know you're going back to Idaho. Are you coming back next year?
Yeah, it sounds like I'll be back next year.
Great, so maybe we can hear an update. So
Yeah.
thank you very much, and thank you everybody for coming. And if anybody wants information about any of the volunteer opportunities that either Megan or I talked about, I actually have some cards I can hand out. You can email me for more information. Yeah. So thank you very much for coming.
I'm Alberto now. I want to show you this picture.
Oh, awesome. Where is that? Oh,
This is
good
like
one.
one of the restaurants.
Yeah.
And then,
Oh, yeah,
Juvenile?
that's a juvenile. Yeah, that's awesome.
share the crab with the juvenile.
Yes, that's cool to see.
I'm going to show you the lush grasses. This is a Kendall Cross marsh that they got in 1937.
Oh, wow.
So you can see it now.
Yeah,
So
that's your mom? Oh,
That's
wow.
great.
So yeah, look at those beautiful, beautiful grasses.
Yeah, I think that photo was up in the trailer.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, good, oh, good. Maybe we'll bring that back one day.
Is that pickle? What is that?
Yeah, so that's typically.
And those are,
And that's the cord grass.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
That's pickle.
yeah,
It's a big difference.
yeah,
We
very
need them
different,
both, right?
but they seem to like their yeah.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I'm glad you
keep
guys
it up,
like
right? Come back.
Yeah.
Keep going. You're young, we can, another 20, 30 years.
I think I'm on a mailing list for
My friend Mimi.
Yeah.
You're not organizing regular work. He's got a good friend. It's the only person he lives he's like he's on the north side. He's very near the eight. He's like one of the last units there, and he faces. So there's a little gazebo. Yeah, he was interested. Now this guy is he's running around all the time. He does a lot of stuff. I know, I was thinking like, it'd be something that worked for you, maybe we could get some tools and just like, from his place, if we go to his house, he's got a ladder, you can climb on the fence, it's fine right there. Is anyone, yes, you see an old gate. Oh, on the inside. Okay. Yeah. So did you drive into the yeah, yeah, I think it's like easy. Joe sent me. What do you do with the cut up so now he's cut off all his look and then you gather them up.
Yes.
Yes, at the very south end, near the steep road. You get on the on ramp from Sunset Cliffs, and then you pull off on the shoulder, and there's a little band-aid breaking the fence. Sawyer.
This guy's very creative too. Maybe we can organize some stuff and then figure out a way to, bag it up and haul it out. His name is Michael. He's got a long Greek name, like Michael Mitsalukoumakis. Jordan Bean. He works for Jet. Yeah, Stefani's met a couple of her assistants, and she's always peppering her with things about microwaves. Yeah. This game.
So are they all gonna go on too?
Yeah, they all have these two. It is separate.
Yeah, right? Oh, okay, nice. Are you guys gonna go like last step, like open?
Yeah, we've done.